I can solve the problem, but with a condition.
You are welcome to help us.
Happy New Year, everyone. I hope 2026 is already treating you well, but today, I've got a story that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about courage, value, and power. Imagine this: a billionaire worth tens of billions, controlling deals that can make or break empires, and a 12-year-old black girl walking into his world. A girl in a torn blue dress, small, quiet, unnoticed, except for the secret she carries. She whispers 4 words that stop everyone in the room, and in an instant, the billionaire laughs, then freezes. Tonight, you'll watch a story of grit, brilliance, and integrity. A story where one child's knowledge and determination challenge the arrogance of the ultra-wealthy, and where a simple promise to her late father could save her family from losing everything. Every second counts. Every word matters. And by the end, you'll see that the greatest value isn't money, it's knowing your worth. So stay with me until the very last moment, because what happens here changes the lives of everyone involved, forever. The city was alive with the quiet hum of early evening traffic. Rain-slicked streets reflected the neon glow of office towers, and somewhere above, in a small, cramped apartment, Rachel Lewis sat on the edge of her bed. Her hands traced the worn edges of her father's dictionaries, books filled with notes in Dutch, French, German, and Spanish, each page a lifeline, each word a memory of the man who had taught her that language is more than letters, it's power. Rachel was 12, small for her age, her skin a rich brown that glowed softly under the warm light of her nightstand lamp. Her hair was braided neatly, just like her father had shown her. The apartment smelled faintly of old paper, faint coffee, and the damp chill of the city outside. Life had been quiet since her father passed, but the quiet wasn't peace, it was survival. Her mother, Grace, was hunched over a stack of papers at the kitchen table, typing and filing, working long into the night to make ends meet. The rent was due, the bills stacked, and the fear of eviction never far from their small home. Rachel's eyes flicked to the clock. Only a few hours remained before Grace would have to make another desperate call, another plea for time she didn't have. 3 hours before the moment that would define her life, Rachel had been listening to the radio, hunting for Dutch broadcasts like a hunter tracking prey. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, slow and careful. Every language has a heartbeat. Listen closely, and you will understand it. She had learned the rhythm of Dutch, the melody of words that most adults couldn't master in years. And now, that knowledge was about to collide with a world far larger and far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. Later that afternoon, Grace received an urgent call. A major business conference at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel required immediate delivery of sensitive documents. Grace had no choice but to take Rachel with her. They stepped into the lobby, and the world opened up like a dream: polished marble floors, glittering chandeliers, men in suits whose shoes cost more than their monthly rent, and women in silks whispering behind diamond-studded hands. Rachel felt small. Invisible. A child walking in a world built for power, not for her kind of talent. Her mother handed over the documents to a distracted assistant named Derek, who muttered about a disaster unfolding in the ballroom. Richard Hale, billionaire CEO of Hale Energy Corporation, was about to lose an $80 million deal. The Dutch interpreter had been in a car accident, and Vandenberg, the Dutch magnate, would leave in minutes if no one could translate. Rachel's heart raced. Dutch. She could do it. But she was a child. 12 years old. Wearing a torn blue dress. Nobody would notice her. Nobody would believe her. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she remembered her father's words: "Your value doesn't come from what people give you. It comes from knowing what you're worth." And for the first time that day, Rachel stepped forward. Not as a girl in a torn dress, not as a stranger in a ballroom full of millionaires, but as someone who knew exactly what she could do. The ballroom was a storm of motion and noise. Men in tailored suits argued in low, urgent tones. Women in silk dresses whispered behind hands, eyes darting toward the center where Richard Hale, the billionaire CEO, stomped from one assistant to another. The $50 million deal with Henrik Vandenberg, the Dutch energy magnate, hung in the balance, and every second felt like a lifetime. Rachel's small feet barely made a sound on the polished marble floor as she walked toward the chaos. Her heart pounded. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to disappear into the crowd. But she remembered her father's voice, steady and patient. Your skill is your value. Never let fear decide your price. Excuse me, she whispered to no one in particular, her voice small yet carrying the weight of certainty. I can translate Dutch. Hale's head snapped up, his face twisted in disbelief. He towered over her, the shadow of his immense power swallowing her slight frame. You? A child? Dutch. His tone was a mixture of mockery and incredulity. Yes, sir, Rachel replied, her voice unwavering. $1,000. That is my price. The room fell silent. Laughter bubbled first from the corner, subtle, then a ripple that grew, filling the cavernous space. Executives exchanged glances, amused. Security shifted uneasily. Hale's laughter rolled through the room, booming and sharp, a warning and a joke at once. You're joking, he said, still laughing, though now his tone carried the edge of challenge. $1,000? For this? Rachel's eyes met his. Yes. That's all I ask. Not more, not less. For a moment, he studied her, scanning her torn dress, her neatly braided hair, the calm determination in her gaze. This child, barely 12, dared to price her talent. It was absurd. And yet, something in her posture, in her voice, demanded attention. Vandenberg, sitting at the far end of the table, checked his watch. The clock was ticking. The deal would collapse in minutes if no interpreter stepped forward. Hale's assistants were flustered, scrambling for solutions. No one had expected a child to walk into a multimillion-dollar negotiation and offer help. Rachel stepped closer, hands folded calmly in front of her, and began interpreting in flawless Dutch. Her pronunciation was precise, her tone confident, translating Hale's aggressive terms and Vandenberg's cautious diplomacy with perfect clarity. Each word she spoke tightened the room's tension, drawing eyes, silencing whispers, forcing even Hale to focus on the girl who dared to stand in the center of his empire. For the first time that day, the billionaire's laughter faltered. The room's atmosphere shifted from amusement to disbelief. This was no child's game. Rachel had entered the storm, and for every second she spoke, the impossible became reality. Minutes stretched like hours. Rachel's translations continued, each sentence carrying the full weight of the $50 million negotiation. Vandenberg's eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her with astonishment. He had been ready to leave, ready to walk away from the deal. Yet here was a 12-year-old girl, articulating his language with perfect nuance, turning hesitation into dialogue and frustration into clarity. Hale's fury simmered beneath the surface. His empire, his ego, his control, all challenged by a child in a torn dress. Every word she spoke chipped at his authority, yet he could not stop her. Each accurate translation was a blow to his assumptions, that only power and wealth commanded respect, that age and status determined capability. The first micro-cliffhanger hit as Vandenberg asked a pointed question about contract terms, and Rachel paused, just long enough to make the room hold its breath. Then, she delivered the perfect translation, capturing the intent, the subtle threats, and the humor hidden in Vandenberg's words. A collective exhale swept through the room. The executives, the assistants, even the security guards were captivated. Hale, meanwhile, struggled to maintain composure. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, flicked to Rachel repeatedly. There was something familiar about her confidence, something that stirred a memory long buried. He remembered his mother, Martha Hale, working late into the night, teaching him resilience, independence, and the value of skill over inheritance. Rachel embodied that spirit in a way he hadn't seen in decades. Another turning point came when Vandenberg made a subtle joke about American business practices. Laughter rippled across the table, but Rachel didn't stumble. She translated it flawlessly, capturing the humor and timing, leaving Hale momentarily speechless. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of astonishment. How could a 12-year-old navigate not just language, but culture, tone, and intent? Tension spiked again as a technical term related to energy infrastructure arose. The air grew thick. Hale's assistants exchanged worried glances. Rachel's lips moved swiftly, eyes sharp, translating complex jargon into precise English. Every correctly interpreted phrase tightened Vandenberg's trust, solidifying the deal that had almost slipped away. But then came the subtle psychological turning point. Hale's attention wavered, and he saw more than skill in Rachel. He saw integrity, courage, and self-worth. Her calm defiance, her refusal to be intimidated, reminded him of lessons he had long ignored. For a man who built his empire on fear and leverage, this child's presence was a mirror, reflecting the truth he had avoided. Wealth cannot command respect, only honor and skill can. By the end of this act, Rachel had done more than translate words. She had shifted the power dynamic. The negotiation teetered, suspense hanging in the air, the room electrified with disbelief. Vandenberg was impressed, Hale was unsettled, and the audience, both in the room and those who would hear the story, was left on the edge of their seats, wondering, could a child really save a $50 million deal? And if she could, what would happen next? The room had shifted. What had begun as chaos, a multimillion-dollar negotiation teetering on the edge of collapse, was now a stage where a 12-year-old girl dictated the rhythm of events. Rachel stood poised in the center, translating with calm precision. Each sentence she delivered carried weight beyond the words, intent, tone, and subtle cultural nuance, all flawlessly interpreted. The executives watching whispered to each other, their astonishment palpable. No one had ever seen anything like this. Vandenberg, the Dutch magnate, leaned back in his chair, nodding subtly. His patience, once waning, was now replaced with trust. He could see that the deal might survive, if only the girl continued her flawless work. He glanced at Hale, whose face was pale, jaw tight, and fists clenched. The billionaire's mask of control was slipping, revealing a man long accustomed to bending others to his will, now confronted with someone he could not intimidate or buy. Then came the moment that changed everything. Hale's eyes, usually fixed on profit and control, flicked to the small, determined figure before him. He saw not just skill, but integrity, courage, and an unshakable self-worth. Memories surfaced, unbidden, his mother, working late nights to teach him the value of hard work, his own childhood pride in mastery, the lessons lost in decades of wealth, ego, and entitlement. Rachel's presence was a mirror, reflecting a truth he had buried long ago: respect cannot be purchased. It must be earned. Vandenberg's tone changed. "Where did you learn Dutch?" he asked, curiosity laced with admiration. Rachel's answer was simple, unwavering: "From my father." He said it was the language of patience and precision. Silence followed her words, heavy and reverent. Even the murmurs in the room quieted. It wasn't just her skill, it was her story, her conviction, her unwavering sense of value. Hale swallowed hard, a rare crack in his armor. He realized that the power in this room was no longer about money. The $50 million deal was no longer the point. What Rachel possessed, knowledge, courage, integrity, was something he had chased his entire life, only to overlook in his pursuit of wealth. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless in the presence of someone who could not be bought. The final reveal came subtly. Vandenberg's nod of approval confirmed the deal. Hale's competitors and assistants had been watching him, expecting him to command the room, to assert dominance. Instead, they witnessed a child, with nothing but her skill and confidence, resolve a situation they had deemed impossible. A murmur of disbelief swept through the onlookers. Respect had shifted. The narrative had flipped. Rachel's mother, Grace, who had been a silent observer, stood frozen near the wall, tears threatening to spill. She had watched her daughter, day after day, develop a skill that now saved not only a $50 million deal but also their dignity. She realized that the world, cold and ruthless as it could be, had just witnessed something extraordinary: the triumph of talent and integrity over status and intimidation. And then Hale reached into his jacket. The billionaire, who had never offered anything without expectation, held out a thick stack of bills. $1000, he said quietly, almost reverently. The room collectively held its breath. Rachel shook her head, her voice firm. "I only asked for $1,000. That is my price." The weight of that decision, the refusal to be tempted by excess, reverberated through the room. The ballroom was silent now, save for the low hum of tension between two extremes: a child in a blue dress, standing firm, and a billionaire used to commanding the world with a word. Rachel continued translating, her small hands steady at her sides, her eyes focused, her voice carrying every ounce of confidence she had nurtured over years of late-night study and whispered lessons from her father. Then came the first major reveal, not from words, but from presence. Hale's gaze, sharp and cold for decades, softened as he watched her. He saw something he had almost forgotten, someone who knew her worth without being asked, someone whose value was not measured in money but in skill, courage, and integrity. His lips parted slightly, not in anger or disbelief this time, but in a dawning realization. "Who taught you this?" he whispered, almost under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. Rachel did not answer immediately. She glanced toward her mother, Grace, who stood at the edge of the room, wide-eyed and tense. Then she looked back at Hale. "My father," she said softly. "He taught me that words are power. That knowing what you can do is worth more than any amount of money." Vanderberg's eyes widened. Even he, a man accustomed to billion-dollar negotiations, recognized the rare intelligence and confidence in this child. "She is remarkable," he murmured in Dutch, leaning forward, his expression a mixture of awe and approval. Hale's assistants shuffled nervously. The room's attention pivoted from the technicalities of the deal to the spectacle unfolding before them, a billionaire confronted with the truth of his own life, mirrored in a child's determination. Then came the next reveal, the moral pivot of the story. Hale, accustomed to bending everyone to his will with wealth or authority, realized he could not command Rachel. She had priced her service, $1,000. Nothing more, nothing less. And she would not waver. For the first time in decades, Hale encountered resistance that was not about money, not about negotiation strategy, but about respect, integrity, and self-worth. The micro-cliffhanger hit when Rachel corrected a subtle misinterpretation that Vanderberg had almost missed. In that instant, the deal hung by a thread. Every dollar, every term, every nuance could still unravel. The room exhaled collectively as she restored clarity, bridging the gap between two worlds, the vast empire of Hale energy and the human precision of a child who refused to be intimidated. And finally, the personal reveal. Hale remembered his mother, Martha Hale, tireless, determined, proud, who had taught him that integrity was stronger than influence, that character outweighed wealth. For a man who had built an empire on fear, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of power, this memory surged to the surface, overwhelming him. Rachel, unknowingly, had forced him to confront the man he had become, and the one he once aspired to be. Vanderberg leaned back, smiling faintly, and said in English, "She is the interpreter I have waited for. She speaks not just the language, but the intent. Let us proceed." The final reveal of this act, Rachel's quiet courage had not only saved the $50 million deal, but it had also unmasked the billionaire's vulnerability. The power dynamic had shifted. A 12-year-old girl, standing tall in a torn dress, had reminded a man who controlled billions that true authority comes from skill, not wealth. As the act closed, the camera of the mind lingers on Hale's face. Pale, tense, eyes wide with shock and something else, an emotion he hasn't felt in decades. Respect. Awe. And the realization that no amount of money could buy the lesson this child just delivered. The ballroom was quiet now, but not serene. The tension that had crackled for hours had shifted into something heavier, more intimate. Richard Hale, billionaire and titan of industry, stood frozen mid-step, staring at the small girl who had dared to defy him. Rachel's hands rested calmly at her sides, yet every fiber of her being radiated strength. She wasn't just translating words anymore, she was holding the weight of the moment, balancing the fate of a $50 million deal on her young shoulders. Vanderberg leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. The Dutch magnate's patience had carried him this far, but even he was beginning to recognize something extraordinary. A 12-year-old child was outshining experienced negotiators. She spoke with authority, fluency, and precision, and yet there was something else beneath her words, a subtle dignity that demanded respect that no amount of money could purchase. Hale's assistants whispered nervously to one another, glancing at the small figure in disbelief. They had seen deals collapse for far less than this. They had witnessed billion-dollar negotiations unravel due to arrogance or oversight. But Rachel? She seemed untouchable. Not because of money, not because of connections, but because of something far rarer, character. Then came the moment that would shake the room, and Hale himself, to the core. Vanderberg raised a hand, pointing to a clause in the contract. This section, our non-negotiable terms, are you sure he understands? The question was subtle, but the implication was heavy. One misstep could ruin everything. Rachel's gaze met Hale's. She could feel his eyes drilling into her, a mixture of disbelief, fury, and something softer, almost unrecognizable. She inhaled, steadying herself. Then, in perfect Dutch, she delivered the interpretation flawlessly. Not just the words, but the nuance, the intent, the emotion behind each phrase. Vanderberg's eyes widened. Hale's jaw clenched. The room exhaled as one. It was then that Hale felt it, the shift. This wasn't about money anymore. The arrogance that had defined his life, the relentless pursuit of wealth and power, the unspoken rule that everyone could be bought, none of it mattered here. Rachel had done something no one else ever had. She had reminded him of his own humanity. Memories surged unbidden. His mother, Martha Hale, working 3 jobs to keep food on the table, teaching him to value skill over status, integrity over wealth. He had spent decades ignoring that lesson, trading it for control, for accumulation, for the hollow victories of a life measured in dollars. And now, standing in the middle of his empire, a child reminded him of everything he had forgotten. Rachel finished interpreting and looked at him, her eyes steady, unwavering. She didn't need to speak for herself. Her presence, her courage, her refusal to be intimidated, said everything. Hale felt something cracking inside, a wall built over 30 years of business and dominance. He had been so focused on controlling the world that he had lost control of himself. Tears pricked his eyes. A single, hot drop slid down his cheek before he could stop it. The room's atmosphere shifted from awe to tension to something profoundly human. He was no longer a titan negotiating a multimillion-dollar contract. He was a man confronted by the truth he had spent decades avoiding. Rachel stepped forward, ever so slightly, and placed her small hand on Hale's arm. The gesture was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight far greater than any financial transaction. "It's okay," she said softly. "My father said that the hardest part of changing is admitting you need to. You already did that." For a moment, Hale couldn't speak. He looked at her, this small, determined girl who had saved a deal, challenged his ego, and reminded him of who he could be. The sob that escaped him was raw, unfiltered, a sound that no boardroom, no contract, no fortune could have evoked in anyone else. Grace, Rachel's mother, stood frozen near the wall, witnessing it all. Her fear, pride, and relief collided into a single moment of silent awe. Her daughter had not only saved their home, not only secured the deal, but had reshaped the heart of a man who had long believed that nothing could touch him. The $50 million deal was no longer the focus. The real triumph was the courage, integrity, and unshakable self-worth of a 12-year-old girl who refused to be bought, who refused to compromise, and who reminded a billionaire that character is priceless. And in that moment, the entire room understood, this wasn't just a negotiation. It was a reckoning. And Rachel had won. The room fell silent. The last echoes of negotiation had faded, leaving only the hum of disbelief and the soft shuffle of footsteps on the polished marble. Richard Hale stood frozen, his expensive suit wrinkled from tension, his hands trembling as he held the stack of bills meant for Rachel. 12 years old. A girl in a torn blue dress had just bested him, not with cunning, not with force, but with skill, courage, and a simple, unshakable truth: she knew her worth. Rachel folded the money carefully, slipping it into the small pocket of her dress. $1,000. Exactly what she had asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. The room had expected drama, bargaining, maybe tears or collapse. Instead, the transaction was quiet, precise, fair. Like every word she had translated that afternoon. Grace stepped forward, still trembling. Her eyes were wide, tears streaking her cheeks. "Rachel, are you sure?" she whispered. But Rachel only nodded, her face calm, almost serene. She had done what needed to be done. She had saved their home. She had proven her skill. She had honored her father's lessons. Hale's gaze lingered on the girl who had upended his world in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The deal was done. The $50 million had been secured. The room emptied gradually, but he didn't move. Something inside him had shifted, a wall he had built over decades, brick by brick, to shield himself from humility and regret, had begun to crumble. "Mrs. Lewis," he said finally, his voice low, careful. "I'd like to speak with you next week. My company, we look for people with real ability. Not just impressive resumes. You raised this child. That tells me more than any degree ever could." He reached into his jacket and produced a plain white card, simple and unassuming, but carrying the weight of possibility. "Call my office Monday morning. Ask for my assistant. Mention me." Grace's fingers closed around the card as if it might vanish. I don't understand," she murmured. "Why?" "Consider it a debt," Hale replied, almost to himself. "A debt I didn't know I owed." He looked at Rachel. She met his gaze evenly, as if understanding a truth beyond money. Then he did something no one had ever seen him do. In 3 decades, he had never knelt for anyone. Yet here he lowered himself to one knee, eyes level with Rachel. "I owe you an apology," he said, voice thick. "When you walked in, I laughed. I dismissed you because you were young. Because you were poor. Because I thought I knew what value looked like." Rachel didn't flinch. She only listened. "My mother, she raised me alone," Hale continued, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "She taught me integrity, hard work, honor. I forgot all of it somewhere along the way. But you reminded me. In 1 hour, you reminded me what matters." Rachel stepped closer, placing her small hand gently on his shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "My dad said the hardest part of changing is admitting you need to. You already did that." For a long moment, Hale could not speak. The man who had spent decades measuring value in millions of dollars now felt the gravity of a single, simple lesson: respect, integrity, and self-worth cannot be bought. Grace wrapped her arms around Rachel. The two of them turned toward the exit, leaving Hale kneeling amid the marble and crystal of a world he had dominated for decades. Yet in that moment, he was no longer a billionaire trapped by ego, he was a man who had remembered what it meant to be human. Outside, the city continued its noise, indifferent to the events that had just unfolded in the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. But inside that small apartment, the $1,000 lay on the table. A small sum to most, a lifeline to them. And more importantly, a quiet proof that courage, skill, and self-belief can change outcomes far greater than money alone. Rachel rested her head against her mother's shoulder, the rain tapping gently against the window like a soft applause. "Mom, do you think Dad would be proud?" Grace kissed her forehead, smiling through tears. "He's been proud of you every single day, baby. Every single day." And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, Rachel felt it, the echo of her father's voice, steady and warm, reminding her always, "You decide your own worth. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Love this story? Sparkling Heart don't miss out on more heart-stopping, unforgettable romance tales. Subscribe now to Anna's channel and let every story sweep you off your feet. Your next favorite love story is just a click away.